Hello, and welcome to Socialism, the weekly Marxist analysis podcast from the Socialist Party. Unpredictable, volatile, and unstable. 3 words which sum up the situation facing new Tory Prime Minister Boris Johnson. This right-wing populist is quick to make promises, but he's presiding over the same slow-motion car crash of British capitalism and the Conservative Party that destroyed Theresa May. With a snap election ever more inevitable, this episode we ask, what are the prospects for the new PM and for capitalism in Britain? Plus, stay listening at the end for our brand new segment on the latest worker struggles, alongside what socialists are fighting for in response to recent national events.
Thanks for that. James Ivans here from the Socialist newspaper editors department. In a development that has surprised no one, Boris Johnson has won the Tory leadership race and is now Prime Minister. He's immediately made a series of populist announcements promising money here and there to try to distance himself from the dead duck premiership of Theresa May. But in Brexit, he's facing the exact same establishment impasse and must make the exit process and his domestic policies pay for big business and the super rich. This episode will be asking Clive Heemskirk from the Socialist Party's Executive Committee what lies ahead for Boris, Brexit and British capitalism. Hello, Clive.
Hello, James.
So just 92,153 people voted for Johnson to move into number 10. That's smaller than the membership of England's Netball Association. How did this happen?
Well, that 92,000 figure is the number of Tory party members who voted for Johnson, with 46,000 voting for Jeremy Hunt, his rival candidate. But that total figure actually shows the completely shallow social base that the Tory party now has. This is the oldest capitalist party in the world, in fact the oldest party in the world. The vast majority of the capitalist class in Britain wanted to remain in the EU. After all, it's a bosses club that's implementing Thatcherism on a continental scale. And after the referendum, they had hopes they could reverse the results, if not by a second referendum, as has been done in Ireland and Denmark in the past, at least by getting the best possible Brexit in name only deal. But the problem is they don't have a reliable political instrument to achieve that. We are facing, in other words, a crisis of capitalist political representation, and that's shown itself in the election of a maverick figure like Boris Johnson. Now, the Tories are profoundly split. They are a capitalist party, but like all capitalist politicians defending a system that's based on the exploitation of the majority by a small minority, they have to find a way to rule. They can't rule in such an open fashion. They can't say we're the party of the 1%, even though they are the party of the 0.2%, but that's another issue. So they have to try and divide the working class, which they do by ideological means. That includes religious division, sexism, and of course nationalism and its most extreme variant, racism. But the problem is that the Tory party too has been transformed since the end of class politics, the triumph of the free market over socialism with the collapse of Stalinism, which of course wasn't socialism for us, but it was seen as an alternative to capitalism over 30 years ago. And the Tory party has fallen in membership, had a mass membership of over 2 million in the 1950s, to a membership of 160,000 today, whose main financial contributions, is well known, last year was to actually die rather than paying their membership subs. It turns out that's how they raise more money that way than from the actual members. And by the way, talk about the Netball Association. Well, 160,000 members, which is the Tories' claim to membership, is actually less than the 250,000 companies, the 240,000 companies that export to the EU, for example, and they're not all owned by one individual. But not even the owners of those companies are in the Tory party at this stage. And it's become a narrow, dysfunctional sect for the capitalists. It's still, of course, committed to capitalism, but the main ideological glue that holds together the party members, that gives them the ideological motivation to get up on a wet Sunday and go leafleting and so on, is above all nationalism, the idea of Britain's glorious past and so on. And when they were presented with Jeremy Hunt or Boris Johnson, it was obvious who they were going to choose. Johnson, over a Remain supporter in the 2016 referendum.
Now, you've spoken a little bit about this already, but it's clear that Johnson has a different political style to perhaps traditional Tory leaders. He presents himself, as you said, as a maverick, and alongside the expected tax cuts for the very rich. He's promised more money for elderly care and policing. He's also promised so-called free ports, tax-free import areas, which he claims will create jobs. Why is he doing all of these things, or at least promising them?
Well, that fits in with the point that I've just made. I mean, actually, Bernard and Bevan put it in a different way. That he was one of the leaders of the left, the Labour Party in the Attlee government in the 1950s. And he described the task of the Tory party in the age of universal suffrage, posed the question, how can wealth persuade poverty to use its political freedom to keep wealth in power? Here lies the whole art of conservative policies in the 20th century, as you're in the period of universal suffrage. So the fact that we're seeing a slow motion implosion of the Tory party is a symptom of a more profound crisis of capitalism, certainly compared to the post-war boom, which gave a material underpinning to the base the Tory party then had. You had the prospect of increasing living standards, the idea that the next generation would have a better life than the present generation, so on. That's been completely blown apart since the end of the post-war boom in the 70s, but in particular the inauguration of the age of austerity, the financial crisis 2007-2008. And the Tory party has not been able to overcome that. The capitalists haven't been able to overcome that, both economically and politically. The continuing consequences of the crisis of 2007-2008, economically, as we all know, in terms of the persistence of stagnating living standards. Politically, in the fact that the Leave vote itself was the product of the age of austerity, two fingers to the establishment in reality, and therefore the Tory party or a Tory leader has to find another way, and Johnson is doing that in populist policies. There is an issue, which we haven't got time to discuss here, but how his populist approach can be answered is another question to address. For example, his pledges on elderly care or pledges to increase education spending. In my opinion, that puts the onus really on Jeremy Corbyn and John McDonnell to say to councils that are responsible for those services ultimately, don't wait for Johnson to give you the money, which may in fact actually never, as unlikely to ever arise. Use your reserves, use your borrowing powers now to properly fund adult social care and schools, and we will reimburse you. And let's see if Johnson is prepared to take on even half a dozen councils. Now, took him at his words in inverted commas, called his bluff, and said, yes, we're going to use our reserves and borrowing powers to fund social care now, to make sure there are no further cuts in schools, to fund the deficits that I think 2/3 of schools face at the present time. That's the way to answer his populism, by actually defying him now and taking those measures to defend workers' living standards and conditions.
And of course, we had an earlier podcast which you appeared on, Clive, which went into more detail about how councils do have the power, if they mobilise local resistance in the trade unions, local residents and so on, council workers, to defy central government cuts, and as you said, to use reserves and borrowing powers to implement budgets which can actually demonstrate in practice today what an anti-austerity programme would look like. So that's entirely possible. But just to return to Johnson's victory in the Tory leadership contest, he stood as the poster boy for leaving the EU, based, as he said, on this little Englander, as it's been described, mainly small business people, membership of the very small Tory party base. How does his approach to the Brexit negotiation differ to May's?
First, just one point on the question of small businesses. Well, actually, over 2/3 of Tory party members are retired. So, they're not just like active entrepreneurs. So it really is an ideological remnant, actually, that's congealed in the Tory party at the present time. It's not the finished expression of capitalist interests from the point of view of the system as a whole. But anyway, leave that to one side. On the point about how his approach and negotiations differ to May's, well, actually, at a fundamental level, it doesn't. That's the first point to say. Because at the end of the day, the EU is merely a series of treaties between 28 different capitalist countries, nation states, and all that Brexit is, formally speaking, is the process of British capitalism resetting its relations with those 27 other European capitalist states. And in doing that, in that process of negotiation, trying to reset relations, both Johnson and Theresa May represent capitalist interests. They don't represent the interests of the working class. So at a fundamental level, let's challenge the idea that there's a difference in approach. And actually, even at the level of the type of withdrawal agreement that Johnson can achieve or can even aim to achieve, We shouldn't forget the majority of even Johnson's cabinet voted Remain in 2016.
Yeah, that's right. Was it 16 ministers in his cabinet?
Yeah, so it's at 55, 60%. Slightly less than May's cabinet, but majority voted Remain. Johnson himself voted for Theresa May's Brexit deal in March. That's,
right.
5 months ago. So there is this idea amongst the Remainers for Boris section of the Tory party.
Sorry, the Remainers for Boris section?
Yeah. People like Nicky Morgan's been brought back into the cabinet and so on.
Sure, yeah.
Who've voted Remain. Amber Rudd's still stuck in there and so on. But Boris can do like Charles de Gaulle did in France in 1958 when he came to power, backed up by the Algerian colonialists, promising to preserve France's possession of Algeria, and 4 years later presided over Algerian independence, faced with the mass movement of the Algerian masses and so on. And, by the way, was in the Day of the Jackal film, was chased down to face assassination attempts and so on. I'm not sure the European Research Group, Tory MPs would quite chase down Johnson in that way. But, by the way, they would remove him. And that's the point. It comes back to the dysfunctional character of the Tory party. There's a lot of talk about Johnson's position being bluff, programmes on game theory and stuff like that. And there is that hope that possibly, if anyone can get away with selling a Theresa May type deal, slightly modified, obviously cosmetically modified, it could be somebody like Johnson. But on the other hand, there is that hardcore of the extreme ideological Brexiteers who will resist that.
Now, he's presiding over the same Tory party and the same parliament that was utterly incapable of reaching any agreement on leaving the EU. And you've pointed out how fundamentally he doesn't have a different approach. And of course, how could he, given that behind all these negotiations, this game playing going on at the top, there are multi-billion pound and multi-billion euro multinational industries who aren't just going to accept the outcome of some gentleman's agreement. What is the way forward? What's going to happen there?
Well, who knows? I must admit, I do remember the Private Eye cartoon before, I think it was Christmas Before Last, where they had Scrooge in bed and it was the ghost of Christmas Future haunting him. And the Scrooge figure says, "If you're so clever, tell us what happened over Brexit." And the ghost says, to try to find a way through the parliamentary impasse is very difficult for them. Now, as I mentioned, of course, the EU27 is saying they won't renegotiate the withdrawal agreements, but they could amend the political declaration which accompanies it.
Right.
But that won't be enough.
What's the political declaration?
Okay, so the withdrawal agreement is meant to deal with the basics of citizens' rights, the divorce payments, the nature of the transitional period, and Northern Ireland. All tiny details, but that's one in particular, tiny detail. And that's all it does. Everything else about future relations was contained in the political declaration, which isn't a internationally legally binding document.
Okay.
In the same way as the withdrawal treaty is actually a treaty. And therefore, you could see an amendment in the political declaration. There's a commitment to a customs arrangement which allows for the border in the north of Ireland to remain open and so on. So you could see some amendment to that, but that's still committed to Britain remaining in a customs union, which actually is the way that Corbyn has posed the position in relation to the backstop. And that won't satisfy the European Research Group, the ideological Brexiteers.
Yeah.
And the reality is the Tory party is split. When Parliament reassembles in September, I think there will be a vote of no confidence tabled, and I think the question of a general election is almost certain at some point in the autumn.
But the Tories and the Blairites as well so far seem to have done everything in their power to avoid a general election. Why is that?
Well, historically, in this situation when you have the Tory party showing its dysfunctionality from the point of view of the capitalists, they would be looking in this situation to send in the second 11, and just after England's Ashes collapse. That's not a bad approach, actually. But they were looking to send the second 11. And even before Tony Blair changed the Labour Party, so when Labour was still what we call a capitalist workers' party, in other words, a working class base, the capitalist leaders but they rested on a structure, particularly for the role of trade unions, which the working class could fight for its interests within that party.
Sure.
So it was an unstable form of rule for the capitalists. It wasn't fully under their control, but nonetheless they could lean on it, because it still ultimately acted in the interests of the capitalists, although it was always potentially unreliable. So historically, they were always able to call on the Second 11, and under Tony Blair, actually, New Labour was the first 11.
Yeah.
In reality, because he so thoroughly sterilised the Labour Party from the influence of the working class, both politically, in terms of the abolition of Clause 4, the Labour Socialist Clause, and organisation, with the diminution of the role of the unions, the elimination of the role of the conference deciding policy, and so on. Mm-hmm. Now, Corbyn's victory in 2015 created a new danger for the ruling class. It reopened the possibility of the working class finding political representation through the Labour Party, mm-hmm. and the possibility then of the renewal of socialist ideas on a mass basis. Now, we can say, this September will be 4 years after Corbyn's leadership, that the opportunity has not been seized, really, organisationally and politically, to re-transform the Labour Party into a workers' party under the control of the working class, fighting for a socialist programme. And in many ways, a Corbyn-led government would have some similarities to the minority Labour government in 1924, which was, at that time, Labour was a new party. Mm-hmm. In that sense, it had 191 Labour MPs, there was 159 Liberal MPs and 259 Tories. So Labour was a minority government in 1924, exactly. Yeah. Only this time, that Liberal bloc is in the Parliamentary Labour Party. So you've got,
so it'd be like a minority.
Well, precisely, exactly, within the Labour Party. But nonetheless, even the 1924 Labour government still had enormous expectations placed on it. Mm-hmm. We always have to distinguish between the consciousness of the mass of the population and the more critical layer. And if Corbyn wins an election in the autumn, it would be a government under enormous pressure of expectations from workers to deliver, and that we have to prepare for that. And of course, the ruling class don't want to risk that. They have resolved against a general election, but on the other hand, the dysfunctionality of the Tory party, slow motion implosion of the Tories is gathering pace, and the whole question of the election and what's going to happen, the possibility of the Corbyn government is on the agenda.
Now, related to that question of Corbyn coming to power through there being no option for the ruling class but provoking a general election, the capitalist press, or at least parts of it, have been saying that Corbyn has now committed Labour to remaining in the European Union. Of course, that would have an impact on his electoral prospects. Is that true?
Well, he says the capitalist press, or not all of it. That's an important point. Not all the capitalist press. I mean, the Financial Times, in their serious moments, don't say that. Sure. The Guardian, which is the House magazine of the Blairites, the Blairite wing of the Labour Party, they're still not satisfied with the Corbyn by a long way. And that's a serious point there, that even though Corbyn has failed to decisively overturn the ideological and organisational legacy of Blairism and transform Labour into a mass workers' party with a socialist programme, the ruling class still don't trust him. As I was saying, in a general sense, because Corbyn victory would give enormous confidence to the working class.
And you can see big movements as a result.
Absolutely. But I think it's also true in the particular sense, or the more concrete sense, that he's not a reliable defender of capitalist interests on the EU and Brexit.
Sure.
We shouldn't forget he campaigned in 1975 against the European Common Market, but was renamed as the EU. Mm-hmm. When he was a backbench MP, that's in 1983, he consistently voted against all the neoliberal EU treaties, for example, against the 1986 Single European Act introduced by Margaret Thatcher, working alongside militant MPs, the predecessor of the Socialist Party, our predecessor organisations, our MPs like Pat Wall, Cherry Fields and Dave Nellis. They voted along with Jeremy Corbyn against those measures. Corbyn himself, for example, during the debates over the Maastricht Treaty in 1993, spoke about bankers' Europe endangering the cause of socialism. Yeah. If the principle of European economic policy is to be run in that capital can find a home it's most suitable to it, that means any social policies relating to housing, unemployment, the environment are bound to take second place, and that's why I oppose those measures, and so on.
So it has played out in the EU as well.
Well, precisely, exactly. Greece is the one-word answer to all those who say that the EU is a progressive force.
Sure.
Now, he made a significant retreat from that position when he was elected as Labour leader in September 2015, when the first concession he made to the Blairites was to commit to support a Remain vote in what was then the forthcoming EU referendum in all circumstances. And that's why it has been possible for the Express, the Sun and so on to portray him as an Islington Remainer. It shows the consequences, by the way, of making political mistakes. Probably it seemed a good idea to him at the time to make that concession to the Blairites in the early days of his leadership. And that's rebounded back on him. But we have to say, despite the pressure since the referendum from the Blairites, the Guardian's campaign on Newsnight was almost every week they had something on Corbyn and the pressure he's under for he must make a clear stance and so on. Mm-hmm. He hasn't capitulated so far to the demand to overturn the 2016 results. Even when he's spoken of the possibility of a second referendum, he has ruled out a repeat of it being the same as 2016, straight Leave Remain.
Yeah.
So, for example, in his first broadcast after Johnson's victory on Sky News, he supported a referendum against a no-deal Brexit, if that was what was being proposed by the Johnson government. But he also said, and this has been consistent in his position, that if Labour won a general election, he would reopen talks with the EU about reaching a Brexit withdrawal agreement. And if you think about it, if he got a Brexit withdrawal agreement, which the bottom lines of not accepting EU rules on state aid, not accepting the EU rules on compulsory tendering of public contracts and so on, then why would he campaign against that in a second referendum? So he's not a reliable representative, because particularly those issues are the things which the capitalists like about the EU.
Barriers to nationalisation.
Exactly, precisely, exactly. So that's why the campaign has been stepped up by the Blairites and the establishment media against Corbyn's leadership. He's not a reliable defender of capitalist interests. Could be subject to pressure in relation to domestic politics as well.
And of course, as you said, the enormous enthusiasm and potential movements which a Corbyn government could inspire, that would be a changed situation for negotiating with Europe, and that could put them under pressure to actually, with a very different situation in terms of relations within Europe and a different negotiating team. Now, as you said, the Blairites have been organising openly against Corbyn since he was elected leader of the Labour Party. That organising against him is ever more open, isn't it? So what form do you think the Blairite insurgency might take?
Well, they face a dilemma from a number of angles. First of all, very belatedly, the Labour NEC has started the trigger ballot process, although it's still very drawn out.
So the trigger ballot process, this is where you can change the candidate at the next general election.
Basically,
so it's not the sitting MP.
Although, as far as I can see, the timetable that's started means it's shadow cabinet members first, and then it goes on to other constituency parties, and therefore, over the summer, in the shadow cabinet members' seats, local Labour parties and affiliated organisations, the trade unions or the co-op and so on, are being asked, do they want to move to a full reselection of their MP, or are they satisfied with their sitting MP? And that is then going to go out to the backbenchers. Now, having said that, that's still a long process, which a snap general election, if it's forced in early September for October, would still mean that Yvette Cooper, who's a backbencher, Hilary Benn, who's a backbencher, might not face a trigger ballot. So that's not sufficient. Corbyn should have backed mandatory reselection, period. He's had 4 years to make those organisational changes that haven't happened.
A mandatory reselection would be that every time there's an election, there is just a contest.
Exactly, full stop,
No extra levels or anything like that.
Exactly, But nonetheless, the noose is dangling for some Blairites, to say the least. So that's given them an extra impetus to move. Whether they mount a direct leadership challenge to Corbyn, like they did in the summer of 2016, with Owen Smith as the unlikely standard bearer, or make a declaration in Parliament, form a new parliamentary party of a more substantial character than Change UK.
That would be difficult.
Yeah, well, that's right, absolutely. But let's be clear, Tom Watson has been organising seminars for backbench MPs on how to survive a trigger ballot process, and apparently 160 of them have taken it up.
Really?
Exactly. But that shows...
He's got this group now as well.
Oh, yes, that's right,
Social
exactly.
Democratic
Yes,
group.
exactly. It was organised under that banner. Yeah.
Right.
But that shows the level, that shows what we're talking about. The parliamentary group is 245.
Mm.
So if you're looking at 150 plus who are with Watson, which is probably an accurate reflection, that would become the opposition if they were to split.
Mm.
So that's another variant in the autumn, actually. If there's a vote of no confidence in Johnson, and then you've got 14 days to form a new government, that could be a block. That could be the force that provides a new Prime Minister. Actually, then to ask for an extension on Article 50 with the EU.
Well, the Blairite Social Democratic group.
Absolutely, precisely. As a parliamentary group, as a parliamentary party, in effect splitting away. That's a possibility, but that's a very risky gamble. Mm. Actually, for Watson to challenge Corbyn for leader is a risky gamble.
Yeah.
If he loses, again, like Smith did. Mm. But then to split the parliamentary party and to form a new parliamentary group and leave Corbyn with, 50 to 80 MPs, the third party in Parliament is the Labour Party, that's handing the Labour Party over to Corbyn and the left.
But it would be quite a small party in Parliament.
In Parliament, but on the other hand, some councillors would go with the Social Democratic group, the Watson group, but then also that leaves open those who are left. The trade unions, where would they go? Where would the bulk of the membership go? The Socialist Party would once again apply for affiliation, because actually, by the way, the Jewish Labour movement would disaffiliate, I suspect. The party may disaffiliate, so there'll be vacancies for new affiliated organisations. There'll be left trade unions that aren't affiliated, like the PCS, the RMT.
Sure.
So say, well, look, we want to affiliate, but we want the new Labour Party reconstitute, or the small parliamentary Labour Party which you lead, to have more democratic structures. Why should the parliamentary party maintain the weight when half its members have defected? So that really is a gamble. It's a card you can't play more than once.
So it could actually end up transforming a Labour Party around Jeremy Corbyn into a much larger, more effective, more ideologically clear organisation, which could smash them.
Absolutely. And actually, there's only ever been one national government, that was in the 1930s.
Like Grand Coalition government.
Yeah, well, that's right, exactly. But normally a national government is considered or prepared or discussed after a period where a section of the working class has become demoralised through the experience of Labour in power,
right,
implementing capitalist policies. And that isn't the case now. And that's why it's a particular gamble, because it would leave the Labour Party in the hands of the left, still with the brand of Labour, facing a chaotic situation. Even, by the way, the whole idea of Britain remaining in the EU, first thing that comes up is, will Britain get the rebate that it's had since the 1980s in the new EU budget? For example, even tiny details like that.
Yeah.
There'd be hard negotiations there.
Sure.
And there'd be outrage amongst big sections of the working class that the referendum result has been overturned. So It will be a period of flux. It's a card that has to be very carefully used. And therefore, I think the main point to draw from us, of the Labour movement, is that we can have no compromise with the Blairites, with the Watsonites. The working class must organise still to make sure that the possibilities that were there in the Corbyn leadership for Labour to be retransformed into a mass workers' party with a socialist programme are seized in the next period.
Can we expect any of these strategies from the various different representatives of capitalism, the Tories, the Blairites and so on, to result in a return to the business-as-usual politics of before the 2007-8 financial crash?
To which I think the answer is clearly no. We're just talking about the disintegration of the oldest capitalist party in the world, the possibilities of realignment in terms of the Labour Party and the new social democratic formation, the flux and turmoil in the Labour Party that exists. And it does come back to the point I said earlier, that if you like, that period of flux and instability, the implosion of the Tory party and so on, all of these are symptoms of a more profound crisis of capitalism, which hasn't been able to overcome the continuing consequences of 2007, 2008, both economically and politically. And actually, economically, I think you have to say that the measures that were taken at that time in 2008 to avert the possibility of a 1930s style depression, which was 10 years the lowest ever interest rates.
Constant
exactly. The transfer of private debt onto the public balance sheet, as you say, QE, which in Britain has pumped in over 400 billion into the UK economy, 4.5 trillion in the US, but not into...
Well, we haven't seen any of that.
Well, precisely, it's not into productive investments,
yeah.
but into underpinning financial assets. So it's shifted wealth to asset holders, i.e. to capital, while wages have stagnated. And therefore that's added to a crisis of demand as well. At the same time as creating new asset bubbles or corporate debt and so on, another asset bubble. And the unwinding of those distortion of values that happens in order to avert the possibility of a 1930s style crash. It distorted values between companies, distorted values between countries, and of course distorted values between classes. But all that's done is creating the basis for a new global economic crisis, possibly before the end of the year, but certainly in the next period.
But that would be already taken a battering on the basis of the last economic crisis. Would this be a big setback for the working class?
It would be. It's not something that I don't give the impression that it's like something to anticipate positively, but nonetheless, that is the objective backcloth against which the crisis of British capitalism, the constitutional crisis, the Brexit crisis and the political crisis is playing out. And really, that will have its impacts on consciousness. It will have its impacts on people looking for a way out. And that gives possibilities for socialist ideas to take great leaps forward in the next period. And that does give hope. That does give a certain confidence about the possibilities that open up in the next period for the triumph of socialist ideas.
Meanwhile, of course, the class enemy is falling to pieces.
Absolutely.
And that's quite favourable ground to be fighting on.
Absolutely.
Thanks very much, Clive. And now the new segment which we're introducing for the first time this episode, where we're going to hear an update on some of the workers' struggles as well as developments in national events. So first of all, we're going to be talking with Scott Jones, who works with me on the Socialist newspaper. Hello, Scott.
Hi.
And you'll recognise Scott's voice for doing the announcement at the start of most of the episodes. I understand the main story at the moment is in Northern Ireland, and it's an occupation of a shipyard.
That's right, yeah. It's the Harland and Wolff shipyard workers. Really famous company in sight because they made the Titanic. Long history of employing thousands of workers in the trade in Belfast. The yard is under threat. The jobs are under threat. So
how many jobs is it?
130.
Wow.
So the site used to employ thousands. It's been cut back over the years already. For example, it was in crisis like a lot of the shipbuilding industry in the UK in the 1970s when the UK government nationalised it. But in 1989 it was sold off again to a private company who have made cuts. So it's only now 130 workers, but still very important. A lot of jobs, a lot of skilled jobs for a city like Belfast. And the shipyard's mainly been converted into making parts for renewable sea turbines these days.
Okay.
The workers haven't been paid. That prompted them to protest and occupy the shipyard. Some of their demands, one of the immediate demands, is for the UK government to step in and guarantee contracts, like Royal Navy contracts, which are worth billions, to ensure that there's work. And the workers also calling for nationalisation, which obviously we support. And we say that nationalisation, should be under the democratic control of those workers themselves.
Okay. So the workers have entered occupation, that is them taking matters into their own hands already.
Yeah.
And if the plant is nationalised to take the jobs, why should they relinquish that control?
Exactly.
So there's also been a dispute very near the new Socialist Party headquarters in North London, isn't that right?
That's right, yeah. At Sainsbury's Waltham Point Distribution Centre, just up the road. And it's by Asda members who have been fighting cuts to sick pay. The company are trying to cut it from 26 weeks paid just down to 2.
Wow.
And it's the second strike that's taken place there. And workers told me when I was there, really, about the impact the first strike had, where another nearby distribution centre took 2.5 weeks to get back to normal following the June strike. And many stores had gaps on the shelves for 72 hours.
What else has been going on?
In Hull, at a food processing plant, Carrow Foods workers have also taken strike action there against low pay. And there, a striker explained to the Socialist, the aim is to receive at least the real living wage, as most of their members are on the minimum wage, or just above £8.41, even if they are classified as being skilled. Linked to this as well, there could also be strike action at Wilko's distribution sites in South Wales and in Nottinghamshire.
Okay.
And, all these disputes are really important. They're an example of the fight back that is needed in retail and other associated industries, with closures and job losses left, right and centre, the latest being 4,500 jobs at Tesco. And in this situation, we obviously call for trade union struggle for a minimum wage of £10 an hour for all, with annual increases at least in line with inflation, and to also fight back against the attacks on terms and conditions which have been widespread. And following on from that, down to the work of Socialist Party members in the Shop Workers Union Asda, that union is committed to calling for the nationalisation of failing companies. But we go further as well and call for all these companies to be nationalised under democratic workers' control.
Thanks very much for that, Scott, and we'll hear more next episode. And now we'll be talking to another member of the editorial department of the Socialist newspaper, Ian Patterson. Hello, Ian.
Hello, thanks very much for having us.
So, first of all, Ian, the Labour Party has made a statement against privatisation in councils, is that right?
The Labour Party said that when they get into government, they're going to bring back council services back in-house.
That have been privatised.
Exactly, stop council privatisation, which we think is really welcome, but it doesn't come without its problems. Those Labour councillors that are supporting cuts, supporting privatisation, the Blairites, they've got to be kicked out of the Labour Party.
Okay, so that would allow us to start actually bringing council services back in-house now.
Exactly, and we'd say it's a welcome policy, but it's got some limitations. The companies that are, renationalised at a council level, they should only get compensation on the basis of proven need. We're not going to pay huge amounts of taxpayers' money to big fat cat companies.
They've had enough already.
Exactly, and we don't have to wait for these contracts to expire. Let's do it straight away on the basis of a determined workers' movement. Labour controls a lot of councils now, so let's start implementing that policy now.
So it won't have escaped people's attention, particularly in Britain, that it's been very hot here recently. Do we have anything to say about that?
It was very hot. We definitely felt it. It was the hottest day ever, 38.7 degrees. And as well as being extremely uncomfortable for workers, it was affecting infrastructure. When the trains were breaking down on the hottest day ever, I thought the transport system has to be renationalised. In Southampton, there's been protests because Carnival cruise ships keep their engines running 24 hours a day, emitting 10 times more sulphur than every single car in Europe, 260 million cars.
It must be filthy there.
And that's why people have been protesting. And it shows it's a tiny number of companies that are producing this pollution, causing climate change. We think these big companies got to be nationalised on the workers' control so the workers can plan production to meet the needs of the environment and also make sure the trains run and everything else.
There's also been community campaigns in London against fires that have taken place recently.
There was a fire in Walthamstow a couple of weeks ago. Part of the mall there was destroyed. I actually saw it on my way into central London. Thankfully, nobody was killed. The emergency workers, the transport workers, did a brilliant job of making sure everything got back as quickly as possible. This fire in Walthamstow is particularly important because the fire took place directly opposite the square where there's been a campaign to stop the square being sold off to private developers to make flats for a tiny number of rich individuals. We called an emergency public meeting by the campaign in response to the fire to say we don't want any disaster capitalism here. In other countries where there's been a flood or a fire, it's been a chance for private companies to come in, take public resources. We don't want that to happen. If anything, the opposite. The mall has lost the right to that land that is loaned to it by the council. Let's give it over to the community so we can build council homes, create decent jobs, but more parks and space for working class people.
Thanks very much, Ian.
Thanks, James. We want you to send us recordings from picket lines and campaigns and reports of your activity. We also want your questions, comments and ideas for future episodes. Email socialismpodcast@socialistparty.org.uk and help us spread the word by giving us a 5-star review and subscribing so you don't miss out. You can read more about what we think at socialistparty.org.uk, and as always, if you agree, join the Socialists. Socialism is produced by the Socialist Party. This week we heard from Clive Heemskirk, speaking to James Ivans, along with Ian Patterson and me, Scott Jones. Till next time, solidarity.